It's said that outside Harvard University's athletic fields lies a small graveyard, within which there's a tombstone named Fieser. This place bears no name of a cemetery or a monument. Only the name Fieser, along with his birth and death years, are inscribed. Some describe him as a genius whose talents were confined, and to this day, Harvard's organic chemistry textbooks are still based on the templates he developed. He successfully mentored 3 Nobel laureates and over 400 PhD students, earning him the title of a leading figure in the field of organic chemical synthesis. However, why is there no inscription or sentence on the tombstone of this patriarch? Today, let's delve into this history. Welcome to Uncle Tony's Storytime. Tracing back to 1939, when World War II was still raging. But did 40-year-old Professor Fieser still remember the research topic about synthesizing vitamin K? In Europe, soldiers were on the brink of bleeding out, in dire need of vitamin K. Vitamin K is essential for the human body to produce clotting factors and also aids in improving bone health and repair functions. Thus, on the battlefields of Europe, medics urgently needed vitamin K, given the prevalence of bleeding disorders and fractures. However, at that time, the extraction of vitamin K was limited to spinach, fermented foods, and animal offal, making its availability extremely scarce. Therefore, Professor Fieser planned to apply his expertise to develop a method for synthesizing vitamin K on a large scale using chemical reagents directly. This method would not only be highly pure, but also allow for targeted supplementation of K1 and K2. K1 is primarily responsible for clotting functions, while K2 focuses on bone repair. Undoubtedly, continuously delivering these vitamin Ks to the battlefield would save many lives. As expected, by 1940, Professor Fieser's lab had successfully synthesized vitamin K, only a step away from its industrial production. However, at this critical moment, he received a mysterious phone call, with the caller on the other end being from the White House staff, informing him that a car was waiting for him downstairs. Fieser dared not delay. Thus, on June 27, 1940, he had the privilege of having a face-to-face discussion at the White House about the situation at the time. In the United States, among all the top experts, President Roosevelt was also one. In fact, as the war in Europe intensified, the White House decided to establish the National Defense Research Committee, aiming to unite the military and scientific researchers to develop weapons needed for the war. This project was named the Joint Military Academic Research Effort, and the well-known Manhattan Project, led by the University of Chicago for atomic bomb development, was a part of this grand endeavor. On that day, the Joint Military Academic Research Program identified 5 main divisions, drawing participation from 41 universities.
Independent research was conducted on new types of radar, superweapons, ballistic missiles, tank landing ship, and espionage equipment.
Professor Fieser was assigned to use his chemical expertise to help the U.S. military develop an advanced superweapon. He was part of the same group as Oppenheimer, who led the atomic bomb project. By then, the research direction of physicists like Oppenheimer had become clear. However, Professor Fieser still found this confusing. He was a chemist capable of synthesizing vitamin K, recently hailed as a medicinal god for treating the wounded. But in the next moment, he was asked to become a harbinger of death like Oppenheimer, which he found quite troubling. Was Professor Fieser willing to take on this significant task? Upon returning to the university, Professor Fieser carefully selected 5 assistants and informed them that the current vitamin K development project needed to be put on hold. Now, they faced a more urgent task. In fact, Professor Fieser's success in synthesizing vitamin K had already been widely predicted by the academic community as a strong contender for the Nobel Prize. Nevertheless, Professor Fieser firmly paused his current research activities to focus on how to develop an advanced superweapon for the U.S. military. Fieser came from a wealthy family in Ohio, with his grandfather being a German banker and his father an engineer. Fieser himself was an athlete in football since a young age. Indeed, before the age of 18, no one would have believed that this young man would become a chemistry professor. He was admitted to Harvard University's chemistry department through a special recruitment for football players. However, teachers in the chemistry department generally believed that chemistry, especially organic chemistry, was undoubtedly a subject full of creativity and inspiration. Thus, Fieser was undoubtedly that unique, inspiration-driven contender with a distinctive frame. During his time at Harvard, he realized he was not only a future star in the laboratory, but also a key center in American football. Tall, wealthy, handsome, and more importantly, endowed with exceptional eloquence, high emotional intelligence, and first-rate academic prowess, he was the perfect idol. However, Fieser struggled for months to find the right inspiration. What kind of weapon could be considered a superweapon? Fieser stepped onto the football field again, and despite being over 40, he could still fiercely compete with men in their 20s. Suddenly, an assistant urgently sought Professor Fieser's help, mentioning an unexplained explosion at a soil factory on Long Island. The factory's supervisor and the police hoped he could visit. So, Fieser removed his gear and went with his assistant to investigate the factory. He was drawn to a specific coagulant used in paint manufacturing. He observed how the liquid coagulant gradually solidified in the air, becoming stickier upon contact with it. At that critical moment, Professor Fieser stood up, politely bid farewell, and while walking away, explained that the explosion and fire were triggered by this coagulant. He advised that in future transportations of the coagulant, ensure the air is not contaminated, and said he would leave his assistant behind to help everyone. He also mentioned that he had some urgent matters to attend to back at his school that needed further discussion later. Thus, as the car first headed towards the Long Island Bridge, Professor Fieser's thoughts were filled with revelations about the superweapon. Yes, fire. The fire of hell, without the need for unbelievable atomic energy or dangerous biochemical agents. 100 years ago, humanity had mastered the technology of natural fire. 800,000 years ago, we learned to create fire using flint. 400,000 years ago, we used fire to drive away wild animals. And 3,000 years ago, we waged wars with flames. Yet, even today, our knowledge of fire remains incomplete. What fundamentally differentiates this from 400,000 years ago? Rain extinguishes fire, and flames do not burn out instantly, but spread to their surroundings. However, as a chemist, I indeed have a solution. I can make flames burn rapidly in water and ensure complete control over the flames to prevent unnecessary damage. At the same time, the flames I envision are sticky and cannot be entirely extinguished. On his return drive to Harvard University, Professor Fieser had a clear understanding of everything. He intended to mimic the coagulant from the paint manufacturing plant to produce a sticky, organic gel-like substance. Once this gel attached to skin or tanks, it couldn't be entirely removed. Next, by mixing gasoline into this gelatinous substance, it would have the capability to burn continuously. Even the tiny dispersed gel particles could burn for a long duration, potentially causing fires. It also necessitated mixing a certain amount of oxidizer into the gelatinous substance. Even if oxygen was cut off underwater, the oxidizer within the gel would still enable the flames to keep burning aiming to replicate the effect of white phosphorus bombs by incorporating white phosphorus during the weaving process. Thus, even if you manage to extinguish it, the 40-degree ignition point of white phosphorus would immediately reignite it. Additionally, a thermite agent could be produced to make the gel explode rapidly. Thermite reaction technology can penetrate all armors, allowing the flames to directly breach the cockpit. That was essentially the plan. Professor Fieser quickly began experiments and soon succeeded in producing several of these incendiary bombs using natural rubber. When the military received a list of samples, they swiftly dispatched personnel to blockade Professor Fieser's laboratory. In 1941, Professor Fieser was nominated for the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for his successful synthesis of vitamin K in 1939. However, at the same time, the U.S. military also implemented a blockade on Professor Fieser's laboratory. All of Professor Fieser's research work was put on hold, and his chance at the Nobel Prize slipped away. The officers were very clear about the current urgent task. They requested Professor Fieser to immediately address the problem of Hellfire. The U.S. military had conducted tests, and it was indeed a superweapon that transcended ordinary thinking. It was affordable and easy to use, but Professor Fieser's natural rubber was too luxurious. As you are aware, the United States and Japan recently went to war in the Pacific region. Japan had taken control of Southeast Asia and cut off all supplies of natural rubber. We need to find a substitute for natural rubber, much like the vitamin K you synthesized incidentally. I request that you also cleverly synthesize a chemical gel, a material that is not only more economical than natural rubber, but also more convenient to use. Let us temporarily name our superweapon Hellfire, which will undoubtedly help bring the war to a swift conclusion. Professor Fieser did not inquire further but quickly agreed to the officer's request. He knew that once the inspiration for resources surged, synthesizing the gel was nearly unstoppable, a task he considered a piece of cake. In the following weeks, the 5 selected assistants also decided to join the lab, cutting off all contact with the outside world. These 6 members conducted highly confidential research. Professor Fieser clearly displayed his research goals on the blackboard. The first type of raw material used was both economical and easy to obtain. Secondly, it had a long shelf life and would not spoil after expiration. For the third type of long-term storage environment, it was essential to ensure that the temperature ranged from -4 degrees to +65 degrees Celsius. The fourth step was to leave the factory, making it easy to produce even on the battlefield. These 4 points undoubtedly posed a huge challenge. However, Professor Fieser's enthusiasm for the challenge was proportional to his performance on the football field. The core issue, first and foremost for Professor Fieser, was that the substance must have a direct connection to gasoline. If other components needed to be added, simply preparing this substance on the battlefield would not be sufficient. Afterward, Professor Fieser continued to explore and identified linoleic acid, a long-chain molecule made of carbon elements. The longer the carbon chain, the higher its viscosity. However, experimental results showed that the viscosity of linoleic acid did not meet the standards, necessitating further optimization. Clearly, a method needed to be found to promote the growth of the carbon chain. Thus, Professor Fieser discovered a substance known as stearic acid, or palmitic acid. Although the carbon chain length of palmitic acid molecules typically consists of about 16 carbon atoms, similar to linoleic acid, a significant feature of palmitic acid is its malleability. Professor Fieser had already used this substance in the synthesis of vitamin K. Therefore, Fieser found another substance called naphthenic acid. a waste product from refineries, and combining palmitic acid with cycloalkane acid resulted in a cyclic palmitate that was both sticky and durable. He added a small amount of aluminum directly into the mix, enabling him to bind 3 long chains, thus further extending the product's viscosity and shelf life. He was pleased to name it naphthenic palmitate, abbreviated as napalm. In that era, using a second-hand meat grinder in the laboratory, Professor Fieser successfully produced the first batch of napalm. Napalm had very stable chemical properties and could be directly transported to the front lines. When soldiers at the front needed to use it, they could add gasoline to the napalm. Discarding this substance, like Hellfire, could convert it into a sea of fire in a short time. In this inferno, napalm bombs would stick to the skin, burning continuously to the bone, and attempts to roll, jump into rivers, or tear it off were futile. It had extremely high viscosity, and the oxidizers in the napalm allowed it to continue burning in water. White phosphorus and thermite agents included in the napalm made the armor inextinguishable and sticky, while the thermite reaction could directly burn through cockpit cabins. Then, on July 4, 1942, American Independence Day, Professor Fieser hosted a napalm bomb explosion test on Harvard University's football field. In the center area of the football field, the test team set up a water pool with a diameter of 55 meters. A napalm bomb was placed in the center of the pool, followed by a massive explosion. Flames and high temperatures of 1,100 degrees instantly covered an area with a diameter of 46 meters, causing the flames in the pool to scatter and continue burning. On the football field of Harvard University, a small human hell was summoned. Tests found that within 15 seconds after the explosion, oxygen in the blast area was rapidly depleted, and high concentrations of carbon monoxide were detected on site. This indicates that in actual combat, even if the enemy forces were not burned to death, they could also die from the intense toxicity and suffocation caused by carbon monoxide in the blast area. This is precisely the terrifying essence of the napalm bomb. Just 2 months later, Professor Fieser proudly delivered napalm to General MacArthur's forces in the Pacific. Upon hearing this news, he stated that this superweapon was not only simple to use, but also possessed astonishing power. From that moment on, the lack of sufficient firepower became a thing of the past, as any place deemed unsatisfactory could be targeted. Without finding a landing pad, U.S. helicopters could fire directly downwards, and by the next day, all the jungle would be burnt to create a large landing pad. However, just when the U.S. military thought all issues had been resolved, Professor Fieser once again emphasized that they couldn't yet take it away. According to ancient legends, in 668 A.D., a craftsman from Syria brought the mysterious Greek fire to the Byzantine Empire. For the next 200-plus years, Greek fire became the Byzantine Empire's secret weapon against the Arabs, which is why the Arabs dared not easily cross the boundary. As for the residents of Byzantium, they always kept the secret formula of Greek fire as their most important secret. Thus, with the fall of the Byzantine Empire, this legendary weapon capable of burning in water and projecting hundreds of meters disappeared. Therefore, napalm should not be seen as a second form of Greek fire. Professor Fieser pointed out that this gel needed proper modification, not direct distribution to frontline troops. Before distribution, it must be ensured that it was difficult to decipher. Despite the urgency, the frontline battles continued. Professor Fieser successfully calmed the anxious officer. He gently asked, "Have you ever had instant coffee?" The officer was puzzled. Professor Fieser further proposed working with Dow Chemical, which had the capability to transform these gels into a powder similar to instant coffee. This powder could be directly packed into boxes and shipped to the front lines. Then, pouring this powder into gasoline barrels at the front lines would form napalm. This batch of powder was not only easy to transport, but also ensured the absolute confidentiality of the formula. Thus, large quantities of napalm powder were sent to the front lines, and the soldiers there realized why not incorporate these powders into traditional flamethrowers. Would this not easily rejuvenate Greek fire? As ancient legends described, just a single spray could reach hundreds of meters. The instantaneous high-temperature explosion turning the entire line into a blaze. Moreover, using such a weapon against Japanese forces hiding in underground tunnels and fortifications proved to be an unbeatable strategy. In actual combat, napalm bombs were continuously optimized and upgraded, becoming increasingly fierce. The story did not end there. In March 1943, an officer approached Professor Fieser again, stating that President Roosevelt had tasked us with developing a bat bomb. However, the officers found this somewhat unreliable. Suddenly, Professor Fieser slapped his thigh, declaring it a great idea. He had never anticipated that living bats could serve as messengers for our napalm bombs. With just 17.5 grams, a napalm gel could be attached to the rear of a bat's tail and then dropped. Whenever Japanese buildings appeared, the bats would become very agitated. With just 15 grams of napalm gel, I have calculated that burning a traditional Japanese wooden building could lead to its complete destruction. At that time, Professor Fieser was in charge of a project testing and enhancing the potency of napalm bombs. In the bombing test site, 2 1-to-1 scale towns were constructed according to German and Japanese architectural styles. The Japanese town was primarily wooden, while the German town was mainly brick and tile. Then, we conducted comparative experiments with 2 types of thermite bombs and napalm bombs. According to the experimental data, among the 3 levels of destruction, ABC, although napalm bombs could more broadly destroy buildings due to their power, they were significantly inferior to thermite bombs at the highest level of destruction, C. This is because napalm gel struggles to penetrate deep into buildings, but the situation changes with bats. Bats bringing napalm gel inside houses would undoubtedly significantly increase the napalm bomb's level C destruction ratio. However, subsequent historical records indicate that the U.S. military did not adopt this bat bomb design, and the reasons behind this have not been disclosed. Some speculate that it might be due to uncontrollable bats during the experiment, leading to numerous incidents of friendly fire. Overall, after continuous optimization and improvement, napalm bombs had a broader burning range and higher lethality and penetration capability, even achieving a burning efficiency of up to 81%. In contrast, traditional thermite bombs? Less than 40%. During this period, a vast number of napalm bombs were deployed to the front lines in Germany and Japan, with flamethrowers successfully igniting multiple Japanese islands. The Hellfire released by M1 tanks also destroyed one German bunker after another. Later, in March 1945, the skies above Tokyo would witness the most terrifying power of napalm. On the morning of March 10th, 325 B-29 bombers took off from Saipan, destined for Tokyo, each carrying napalm bombs. These 300 bombers were loaded with 1,000 tons of M69 napalm bombs, a model designed specifically for bombing Japan. The U.S. military marked its ammunition with the words Gel K.O. Tokyo. Inside a single bomb were 38 strands of napalm gel, configured in a cluster bomb design. When released at an altitude of 900 meters, these strands were dispersed in a pattern known as scatter blossom from heaven. That day, Tokyo was transformed into a hell on Earth. One survivor described how large chunks of fire from the sky stuck to his body, impossible to extinguish until the flames burned out completely. Even water could not put out the fire. Even rivers were ablaze. A surviving painter left a depiction of the Sumida River near Asakusa, where a crowd of people on fire rushed onto a bridge, jumping into the river, turning the water blood red. Another survivor said, "The thing stuck to my foot just wouldn't come off. My mother tried to remove it and throw it away. But then it stuck to her hands, and I witnessed her entire body being engulfed in flames." After the bombing, which lasted for 2.5 hours, approximately 100,000 people perished, over 1 million were forced to leave their homes, and most of Tokyo was leveled. In the following 33 days, apart from Kyoto, 42% of the industrial areas in Japan's other 66 major cities suffered fire damage, resulting in 330,000 deaths and more than 8.5 million people being displaced from their homes. The U.S. military dropped a total of 13 million M69 napalm bombs on Japan. Subsequent research estimated that the development costs for these napalm bombs were only $5.2 million. This was merely 1/400th of the $2 billion budget for atomic bomb development. While the atomic bomb project involved 120,000 people, the napalm bomb development team had only 6 members. Robert Neer, an authority on the history of napalm, pointed out the terrifying impact brought by organic chemistry, which is why he began to delve deeply into this topic. Subsequently, on August 15, 1945, Japan announced its surrender. With the end of World War II, Professor Fieser received numerous letters of gratitude from the front lines. The napalm bomb was called "the thing that saved my life," and the napalm cannon was "what got me home early." At the same time, President Truman's medal was accurately delivered to Professor Fieser's desk. The once football star had now become a hero on the battlefield. However, in 1943, the Nobel Prize in Chemistry was awarded to other scientists, Dam and Doisy, who had successfully synthesized vitamin K. The doctor who unleashed Hellfire seemed to receive some criticism in the scientific community. Despite being minor noise against the backdrop of victory celebrations, Professor Fieser still maintained a heroic image. After the war, Professor Fieser returned to Harvard University and continued his commitment to education and research, focusing on developing anti-cancer and anti-malaria drugs. Naturally wealthy and handsome, his humor, wit, and eloquence won the affection of his students. Always dressed in an orange t-shirt and brimming with energy, his teaching materials were gradually incorporated into Harvard University's curriculum. However, after spending over a decade in such a passionate environment, Harvard University began to secretly archive the professor's past experiences. In 1972, a photo titled "The Terror of War" won the Pulitzer Prize. A reporter captured the scene of a young girl, Phan-Thi Kim Phuc, running while the fire behind her was the result of napalm bombs, as described by researcher Neer. This photo sounded an alarm for napalm, and since then, it seemed that people were afflicted by an allergy to napalm, and the photo became a key symbol in judging the goodness or badness of napalm. In fact, since the outbreak of the Vietnam War, the U.S. military dropped over 388,000 tons of napalm in the jungles, more than 24 times the amount used in the Pacific and Japanese theaters combined. Moreover, this napalm, codenamed Napalm B, had undergone a new upgrade. In addition to white phosphorus, thermite, and oxidizers, innovative elements like calcium, magnesium, and lead were mixed into the gel. Calcium powder can effectively cause burns to skin and trees. Magnesium powder helps the gel scatter further. And lead is a cost-effective neurotoxic substance. The composition of the gel was also optimized. In Vietnam, this substance became easier to spread, more explosive, and harder to clean up, completely incinerating vast stretches of forest. Subsequently, medical literature recorded a 102% total body surface area burned, where the additional 2% actually referred to the area of the lungs. This fact is truly horrifying, and when these hellish scenes from the battlefield were revealed, people began to think deeply about war and to reflect on the terror of such indiscriminate weapons. Some questioned if this was the fire of hell. Why would humanity unleash such a terrifying thing upon the world? Thus, when the photo, "The Terror of War," was made public, condemnation of napalm, the U.S. military, Harvard University, and even its inventor, Professor Fieser, reached a peak. In artistic expressions, napalm was vividly described as the flames of the devil and the unclean affair, with painters depicting it as a defilement of the new era, and musicians incorporating the curse of napalm into their lyrics, claiming those gels burned inside children. Anti-war organizations carried out large-scale propaganda. Throughout society, animosity towards napalm continued into the 1990s, with films like Forrest Gump and Fight Club, containing symbolic satire of napalm. In the 1970s, faced with strong public disapproval, Professor Fieser chose to remain silent. Harvard University had already begun to research sealing the history of napalm, and researcher Neer stated that Professor Fieser did not believe he had done anything wrong. In his investigation, he shared with us again these two stories. The first story unfolded in the early stages of the anti-napalm movement, which was initiated by a renowned philosopher, mathematician, and Nobel laureate, a scion of British nobility, starting from 1963. The Earl Russell sent a letter to the New York Times, criticizing the use of such clearly inhumane weapons by the U.S. military. Subsequently, many social celebrities and experts in the scientific community also began to take a keen interest in Russell's stance. However, at that moment, the Pentagon and relevant officials merely smiled and labeled these high-level opposition figures as naive. Yet, a few years later, as American forces became mired in Vietnam, more people began to deeply reconsider the war. The display of napalm was the most obvious, with both images and facts available. Thus, opposition to napalm gradually became an important statement against the war. In May 1966, a protest against napalm erupted across the United States. Protesters blocked the entrances to gel factories and publicly condemned Dow Chemical, claiming that the gel bombs made by Dow were actually their everyday cling film, all coming from the same production line. You could consider lighting cling film and then sticking it to your body. Protesters expressed their opposition to Dow Chemical and the production of cling film. Initially, the story of Professor Fieser being the inventor of napalm was not fully understood. But as time went on, the story was revealed by some, and thus people began to frequently send letters to Professor Fieser, writing, "You're a villain, leave America," and so on. Professor Fieser, indeed an excellent football center, chose not to remain silent, but directly responded in the New York Times. "For the interest of the nation, I would do it again. I would take the same actions." This really drew widespread attention, and a large number of people flocked to Harvard University to protest. Even priests joined the ranks opposing Fieser. Subsequently, in 1967, scientist Near shared his second story. At this point, the direct attacks on Professor Fieser had reached their peak. Despite being 68 years old, Professor Fieser chose to retire that year, still full of vigor. He showed his wife a meticulously prepared retirement speech, which she immediately marked with a conspicuous cross. "If you tell Professor Fieser you have the courage to do this, I'm afraid you might not see the sun next week." Do you remember the test Professor Fieser conducted on the prototype napalm bomb at Harvard's football field? He planned to demonstrate it again in front of everyone, intending to make this part of his upcoming retirement speech. Fortunately, under his wife's persuasion, Professor Fieser did not take such action. Researcher Near noted that Professor Fieser actually did not see his personal invention and the military's weapon as the same thing. He always believed science was innocent. But in reality, after Fieser's retirement, Harvard University locked away his invention, as if the napalm bomb never existed at Harvard, avoiding any association. However, the use of napalm by the U.S. military in Vietnam once again peaked. Countless tons of napalm were thrown into the jungle, as if hell on earth was burning fiercely. Unbeknownst to many, 1980 arrived, and in this year, the United Nations approved an international agreement titled Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. According to Protocol 3 of the convention, the use of napalm against civilians would be considered a war crime. Subsequently, 106 countries around the world signed Protocol 3, but the United States has not signed to this day. It wasn't until 2001, facing strong international demands, that the U.S. issued a declaration to completely stop the use of napalm. However, in Iraq in 2003, the use of napalm by the U.S. military once again came into public view, an event first publicly condemned by American journalists and the British public. Yet, the U.S. military countered by saying the fuel was jet-propelled, not gasoline-based napalm. The British firmly stated, "What you're using is indeed the upgraded high-performance napalm." In summary, it wasn't until 2009 that the United States formally signed Protocol 3, committing not to use napalm anymore. Scientist Near pointed out that napalm bombs still exist today, and their potency is comparable to that of World War II. The cost of manufacturing these bombs is very low. Their production method is no longer considered a secret, and they can now include even more terrifying ingredients, such as nuclear waste and biochemical agents. Currently, napalm bombs are seen as a significant threat to global security, and Professor Fieser might regret seeing these developments. He might never have anticipated that his innovation could awaken the flames of hell in the human world, as described by those who once opposed it. Looking at Professor Fieser's educational and research career, he successfully trained 4,000 students, 400 PhDs, and 3 Nobel laureates, thus being recognized as a leading figure in the field of organic chemical synthesis. In the early stages of the war, he also dreamed of becoming a Nobel laureate for discovering vitamin K and being a medic who could save lives. However, when his country needed him, he did not hesitate to abandon medical research, even missing the chance at a Nobel Prize without any regrets. With only 6 staff members and $5.2 million in research funding, he successfully developed napalm for the U.S. military, contributing to the victory in World War II. Napalm later became a hellfire that could backfire on the U.S. military. Once this flame was summoned to the human world, it could not return. In 2016, a photography team followed Near's research direction, hoping to further explore the history of napalm. At the National Archives in Washington, They noticed archival materials about napalm on the inventory list, but their request to borrow was denied. The archivist stated that most of these visual materials had been discarded, thus refusing the production team's request. It seems, as Near described, certain things have indeed been completely sealed away. Then, the production team walked into Professor Fieser's graveyard, where his tombstone bore no epitaph, almost like an unmarked monument in America, leaving whether it was right or wrong to be judged by posterity. Professor Fieser passed away in 1977 at the age of 78. His final resting place is fittingly located in the direction of Harvard University's football field.